This is Michelle Cox, and this is the story behind my stories.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanders,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Tim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Michelle Cox.
Hey authors, you need an editor in your life. And not just an editor, but an editor that understands you and gets what you're trying to accomplish. That's why you need to visit my good friend Scott Woodley at marlowemoss.net and let him take a look at your work. He'll give you a free sample edit. Scott can help you be the best writer you can be. Visit him at marlowemoss.net. Inspired sentences and polished paragraphs for print-worthy books at competitive rates and always on time. Offering a full range of editorial and ghostwriting services to self-published and traditionally published authors. Turn your ideas into words and see your dreams become books. On the right-hand sidebar of the website at hankgarner.com, you can find links where you can subscribe to the show, and it helps other people find the show. The more people subscribe, the higher we go in the rankings, and the easier people find us. I'd like to thank some sponsors this week for helping us bring the show to you. I, your humble host, have a brand new book out. It's called The Pandora Codex. Oliver Weber, Book 1, A Closely Guarded Secret, a Stolen Artifact, and a Madman Trying to Open a Portal to Hell. Can Oliver Weber become the hero he's meant to be? Pick up the Pandora Codex now. It's the first book in the Oliver Weber series. The second book, Jacob's Ladder, comes out very soon. Go ahead, dig into this series. Grab it now. You won't be disappointed. My friend Patricia Gilliam has a new series called Series Craft 101, and she has a series of books, the Fictional Character Creator Workbook, Setting and World Building Workbook. If you are looking to put together a long-running series like Patricia has done, these are some things that she's learned and that she can help you to get on top of that makes managing a long series much easier. Go check it out. There's a link in the show notes, and we'll be talking about it more. Bocara Brumley has a new book called Imani Earns Her Cape. It's a middle grade novel. You might have heard us talk about it on the show just a week or so ago when Bocara was on. 12-year-old Imani should be celebrating the most important day of her life by eating myrfruit, casting flying spells, and laughing with her mother, but there's just one massive problem. Her mother's been kidnapped by a giant troll, and now Imani is lost in the Fey realm with no way home back to Virginia. Completing her rite of passage alone is inadvisable, but if Imani doesn't want to lose the only family she's ever had, she may have no choice. Transportal train travel, underwater cities, submarines, sea dragons, and unexpected family all combine in Imani Earns Her Cape. Thanks for listening to the show. At the end, as always, we have an audiobook clip from my friend Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Michelle Cox on the show with me. Michelle has a brand new book out called A Promise Given, and it is the third in the Henrietta and Inspector Howard series. Welcome to the show, Michelle.
Thanks, Hank. It's great to be here.
Well, I'm really excited to have you. We begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
That's a good one. I used to try to copy Louisa May Alcott a lot.
What's a good one to copy?
Yeah, exactly. But I never really quite measured up, even in my young mind. So I began illustrating her instead. But I did always have this story that I was trying to write, probably when I was about 10, about time travel. And it was about a girl from the past who came into our world somehow. And I had to give it up finally because I actually had no idea of how modern technology worked. So, when they discovered a microwave, I had no way to describe it to the girl from the past, so I eventually just abandoned it.
I love that.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of when you're learning writing to sort of try to emulate people that you like, and there's I'm not worried about just copying people, because I think there's something that takes over. You just kind of try on someone else's shoes for a while, but eventually you grow into your own shoes. And but I love that you started illustrating around Louisa May Alcott. And what do you think that did for you to kind of get a grip on her style? And maybe do you think that taking an eye from a different angle helped you in any way with storytelling?
Well, that's a great question. I've never been asked that. And, it's just thinking about it, I do think that, because the set that I had her whole set, and it was a Christmas gift one year, and I still say it was probably the greatest Christmas gift I ever got, was that set of books, because I read it so many times, and they also had illustrations in them. So I started out first just copying those illustrations, and then coming up with, and I think that what that contributed to my writing was that I was looking very closely at the details. So I was looking at all of the little things in the background, the fireplace, the clock on the mantle, the ribbons in their hair, anything I was copying, and I think that went into my subconscious. And so when I'm writing fiction, it's just, not to jinx myself, it's easy to copy, period detail. People say that, when they read the books, that they really feel like they're there, that they're in that world, and it's not, it's something that comes very easily to me.
Yeah, I think it's one of the great things about a storyteller that's really tuned into her art is her eye for detail, and I love that. I'm always looking for that other thing that will set me apart from other writers, and any little trick I can use to get into the mind of the characters or into a place. I love that, so I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, exactly.
So when did you decide that you wanted to start writing seriously?
Not really until very recently. I started writing a different novel than the series, and that probably started that around, 2012 to play around with that.
You were an English major in college, weren't you?
Yeah, I was an English major, but for the first 2 years, I was actually pre-med. I was actually a biology major, and I always waffled in high school between wanting to go into medicine or be a writer, and believe it or not, I felt like that writing was scarier, so I went, the pre-med route, and then I realized, this really isn't where I belong. I need to follow my passion. So I majored in lit and noticed it still wasn't creative writing. It was still too scary. So next best thing, lit. And then I got out of college and I got a job eventually working in social service, which again has nothing to do with writing. Then I got married, I had kids and all of that, and it wasn't until 2012 when I had this block of time open up. And I thought, you know what, I can go back to, all of the volunteering and the committees and all that kind of stuff I was on, or I could just take this chunk of time and try to write the novel that I'd always wanted to write. And that was really the start of it.
Well, Michelle, in the moment, it probably didn't seem like social service had anything to do with writing. But I'll bet if you look back now, social service had everything to do with meeting people and hearing stories of people and just, getting to observe interactions that I'll bet have played a big part in writing throughout the years.
Oh, my gosh, for sure. Because I was working in social service in a nursing home, and I write a blog now called Novel Notes of Local Lore. It's been running about 2 years now. I do a weekly post, and it's all about Chicago's forgotten residents. So I take somebody's story each time I change the names, but otherwise the stories are true, and I tell a story, and it for sure that influenced my later writing, because it's, again, these people are, we're living in the era that I write about, the 30s and the 40s, and their stories are just amazing, incredible. I used one story as the jumping off point for my Henrietta and Inspector Howard series, but again, going back to those small details, a lot of that, again, sunk in, and I pull a lot of that out sometimes. Weird things that they would have eaten or whatever, and I try to weave that into the stories as well.
You mentioned writing in the 30s and 40s, and that time period being really interesting to you. A lot of books get written in times that are kind of anchored around major events, maybe World War I, World War II. You're kind of sandwiched in between there. What is it about that time that really stands out to you?
Well, that's a great question too. As everybody knows, that's kind of the forgotten generation between the wars, and it's the era of the Depression, and the haves and the have-nots, and that's also kind of plays into the book or the series. But it's funny because I actually always had more of an inclination to be in the 40s, but the woman whose story I took from the nursing home, she had all of these fantastic jobs in the 30s, and that's when she was a young woman, and one of those jobs was working as a Dutch girl at the World's Fair, and that was in Chicago at the time, and I thought that was such an incredible detail that I wanted to put that and all of these other strange Chicago jobs that she had into the series, and I'm like, wow, I don't know, can I write about the 30s as well as I think I can write about the 40s? And I did a little research, and I thought, you know what, I can do it. So, hopefully I've succeeded, but it seems like it's worked.
Is there a big difference in writing the 30s and 40s? I mean, you think, well, it's a decade, but what are some of the major things that you had to be careful to get right that maybe other people would definitely notice were out of place if you didn't get those right?
Well, I mean, in the 40s, it's you have the whole the war and the war effort, and you had women who, it was okay for them to be working in factories and taking all of these jobs that the men had, and in the 30s, you don't have that. You have, all of these people, men, women, or not women, but men out of work. And so it was very, very hard for women who were impoverished, the way Henrietta is, to find anything. And when they did find a job, they had to hold on to it, so they had to put up with a lot, and bad working conditions and all of that kind of stuff. So I think you really have to get right is the maybe some of those living conditions, working conditions, and also just the mentality of people at the time, which is really hard to write, because you want a heroine that a modern person can get behind and relate to and cheer for, but you have to make it realistic too.
So it's a bigger societal and sociological shift than you think on the surface. There's a lot that happened in that time.
For sure, yes, exactly.
So before we get too deep into that, you said a minute ago that you started writing a different book than what the series is now. What was that first idea that you had? I'm intrigued.
It was also a story that I borrowed from someone at the nursing home, and so I take a little kernel of these stories, and then for the whatever novel I'm writing, I kind of blow it out and fictionalize it and whatever. But this was a story of a woman It was set in the 40s in Chicago, and she had she was a seamstress, and she had a mentally handicapped sister, and her parents end up dying, and this is in real life, and here's this young woman who now has to take care of herself, and she also has this mentally handicapped sister that she has to care for, and it was all about her struggle, and it was kind of a coming-of-age story. So...
You write about Chicago, and Chicago, especially period Chicago, what you're writing about, is definitely a character in the book. Chicago oozes in the story. Did you grow up in Chicago?
I didn't, actually. I grew up in a small town about 3.5 hours west. It's East Dubuque, so right across the border from Dubuque, Iowa. So I grew up there on a small farm, and I won a scholarship to Mundelein College in Chicago. And so I went and didn't ever really leave.
So you've lived there for a while.
Yes.
Yeah. Is writing about a place, and I'm sure Chicago is a world separated now from 1930s, 1940s Chicago. Is it easy to get into that historical feeling and setting? I mean, naturally, you're in the city, but it's a very different city now. How do you peel back the layers of time to get the feeling for that period?
Well, I mean, a lot of it does have to do with having that sort of sensitivity or that ear to talking about the past. So I spent several years in this nursing home listening to people talk about different places in Chicago and different experiences they had, and it really ingrained itself on my mind. And there's still so many, and like Mundelein College was built in 1929. It was a beautiful Art Deco building, and there's so many architectural treasures in Chicago that are still there. Like, the Green Mill Jazz Club comes into the novels, and that's still there, that's unchanged. So you can, I think if you have that sort of sensitivity, I think that you can easily put yourself back and just be aware of what's around you.
So, where did the character of Henrietta come into your life?
What was the question? How did she?
Yeah, how did Henrietta come into your life? I know that you were gathering stories from this from this woman that you met, but how did the character of Henrietta, as she is in the books, how did she form for you?
Well, like I said, I wrote this first novel, and it was very gargantuan. I didn't realize at the time that there was such a thing as a word count. So it was a huge novel, and I couldn't get an agent to read it. I couldn't sell it, and so I said, you know what, I'm going to start over, and I'm going to write something more genre-based, a mystery, something shorter and snappier and more fast-paced, sexier, all of that. So I needed a different type of heroine, and so I looked through my stories, and I decided on this woman who used to follow me around the nursing home, and she was very spunky, and she used to tell me that she once upon a time had a man-stopping body and a personality to go with it. I was like, wow, that's fantastic. So she told me all about her life, and she was this beautiful woman in the 30s, and she had all these strange jobs. She was, an usherette at a burlesque house and a waitress and all of this, but she was also very virtuous, even though she was in all of these seedy situations. And I just thought, you know what, she's the perfect heroine, so I'm going to write her into the book. And it was really halfway through the book that I decided that I could actually make this into a series. So, then Henrietta had to really grow a lot and change, and but that's where she got her start.
Awesome. You having such a strong heroine in the book, was this a... Well, let me ask this. Our sensibilities have changed so much over the last century, and it's hard to look back into a time period and there are things that happen and go on, and you're like, oh man, did we really think that way and live that way? How do you write a heroine that's such a three-dimensional character, put her in this time, and have her resonate with readers? What is that like, playing that balancing game?
Well, it is pretty hard. Because people's understanding of a time period also might not be accurate. So it's hard. It's hard to play the sexuality for sure, because in real life, this woman, I mean, if she was telling me the truth, and I feel like she was, she had all of these very seedy situations, and in fact, even though it was depression, she never had a problem getting a job because she was so beautiful, and I think she used her looks to get waitressing jobs and whatever, but she was constantly getting fired, and it was because she was always getting felt up, and she would slap the owner or the manager or whatever, and then she'd be out. And if you think about what that took in Depression-era Chicago to stand up for herself in that way, that's pretty incredible. So I think that in a lot of ways would resonate with a modern reader. But at the same time, you want to make it as realistic as possible too. Where people having sex outside of marriage, of course they were, but how do you write that in such a way that it stays true to the character, but at the same time true to the times? And what does that character? It's hard to write what her expectation was, because most women at that time wanted to get married and have a family, and that was their fulfillment. And so it's hard to, because you want Henrietta to have that, of course, because you want to bring the romance aspect into it, but you have to put a little bit into her that she wants a little more than that. So but you can't exactly have her stand up to Clive and say, "Listen, Clive, I want a career." That's not realistic either. So you really have to shade it pretty well.
Yeah. Well, tell us about Inspector Howard.
He's completely made up. There was no, reference to him in this woman's life. Again, I might have sketched him a little differently at the beginning if I had known this was going to be a series. But he is the aloof inspector, of course. So he's been through World War I. He's a lot older than Henrietta. And he has a little bit of PSTD, and he has he has his own war wounds, internal wounds that he's nursing. And becoming a cop in Chicago after the war was something that he felt that he could do, and he does not expect to fall for Henrietta. And he asks her in the first book to go undercover for him, and as time goes on and the case gets a little bit more and more dangerous and dark, he then regrets putting her in this position, and then it all gets all messed up and goes from there. But in the second book, we find out that if he wasn't exact, there's a lot more to him, because there had to be. There's more to him than Henrietta first realized. He has there's more to his background that she has to figure out. So,
Well, and 3 books into the series now, I'm sure the characters are have taken on lives of their own. Are they driving you forward into more books of the series?
Yeah, well, book 4 will probably go. I think I'm supposed to be signing the contract for that one soon, so that should be out in spring of 2019. And I am in the middle of writing book 5.
Wow. I love it when characters just don't let you go.
I know, right?
Like, well, I think I'm done with them, and they're like, no, you're not. We've got more stories to tell. Yeah.
That's right.
So after writing that first book, the first Henrietta and Inspector Howard book, how did you go about getting it published? You were a complete newbie to writing and publishing. How did you go about getting the book out to the world?
Well, when I was trying to shop the first book that never ended up getting published, I think I wrote to 200 agents, and nobody was really biting. So I thought, I don't really know what I'm doing. Obviously, I'm doing something wrong. So I decided to go to the Writers Digest conference in New York at the time, and when I was there, to me, the overall feeling was a lot of negativity towards the Big Five, and I was really surprised by this. I was a complete newbie, complete innocent, so I knew very little about the publishing world. I didn't even know there was a Big Five, so everything was new to me. So, and I was surprised that there was so much negativity about getting published and getting an agent, and I thought, wow, I don't even know if I should try. So I walked into this workshop, and it was run by an agent, April Eberhardt, who was trying to explain the 3 ways to get published, and one was self-pubbing, and one was traditional, and then there's a third way that I had not ever heard of called hybrid, and this sounded really, really intriguing to me, really fascinating. It sounded like a perfect mix of the two, and so I went back and did a lot of research on hybrid publishing, and I decided to submit to one of the ones that she had mentioned, She Writes Press, and they initially took my big gargantuan novel. They said, yeah, this is great. And then I sent an email to them as a static. I'm like, wow, you're going to take it at 240,000 words. That's amazing. And they quickly emailed me back and said, wait, whoa, no, there's a problem. We can't run something that gargantuan through the press.
Yeah, that's like 1,000 pages.
Yeah. So, of course I tried to stupidly argue, and I eventually had to give up. And I said, well, you know what? How about I'm writing this mystery novel. What about that? And they said, well, send it over, and we'll see. So they took it, which was great. They do vet. They take about 5% of their submissions. And, I've published with the first 3 books with them. I'm going to publish the 4th, and it's been a great experience. They're a fantastic company.
I think we live in the best time ever for publishing because authors do have the choice. You can self-publish, you can traditionally publish, or you can hybrid publish. And for the first time in a long time, I feel like the power is in the writer's hand for a change, and that there are decisions that can be made. How do you feel like hybrid publishing has helped you?
Well, it's definitely, it's definitely an opportunity to publish. And, I can't speak for all hybrid publishers. I think that, there's good ones and bad ones, although they're recently, I think, the IBPA is coming out with a new set of standards for hybrid publishers. But what it's done is that it allows you, a foot into that, sacred publishing space, or what used to be sacred. And for me, it's one of the things they sell about the company is that you're part of this great community, and it as a newbie, I'm like, okay, that's great, but really that has turned out to be one of the biggest perks is that you have this huge community of authors who are really dedicated to helping each other. I mean, we really help each other market and bounce ideas off each other, and that's been invaluable, and that's something that, my traditionally published counterparts can't often say, and I think sometimes they are writing in a silo. But when she writes, we're very much encouraged to, pool our ideas, pool our resources, just really help each other. So that's great. And then also, it's been just such an education. I mean, Brooke Warner is the publisher, and her whole thing is transparency, and her sort of mantra is that, if you go on to other things, with her blessing, when you come out of She Writes, you will know every aspect of book publishing, every behind-the-scenes thing that happens, so that when you maybe go on to publish with the Big Five, you'll have your eyes wide open. So she's all about education and all about empowering women, and so it's a great company.
I love that idea, that helping authors to navigate the waters and educating while publishing. That's great. That's fantastic. I love hearing that story. Your books are a great blend of genre. They're mysteries, but they're also historical fiction. So you got this historical mystery with a touch of romance, even though I wouldn't call this a traditional romance by any stretch of the imagination. It really reads more mystery, with... I like to think of the characters as being three-dimensional, that, because we all have different aspects of our life, I like to see books where the characters go through the gamut of emotions and interactions and things like that. I think you really do that well. But as a writer and as a publisher, are you ever scared of blending genre? I know that, especially in the Amazon era, where the way we find books is we go to Amazon and we flip through the categories, and we look for things in categories that we like. Well, what happens when your book sits across 5 categories? And are you ever concerned about that? And is there anything that you've learned about making sure that readers can find your books?
Wow.
That was 18 questions, I know.
Where do I start with that? No, it's for sure. And when I started writing this book, I just didn't know enough about genre and the publishing world. I mean, as a lit major, I actually, until I started writing, didn't really read a lot of contemporary fiction. I've been stuck in the classics for years and years and years. So this concept of genres, or even like micro-genres, was really new to me, and I might have paid a little bit more attention. But they say, write what you would like to read, and so that's what I did. I wrote this, and it is kind of a genre blending, and it's something that I really, really worried about, because shifting from book 1 to 2, because 1 is pretty hardcore mystery, and I wrote it that way, not thinking it was going to be a series. But then when I started, branching off into the series, I realized, I don't really want to write a mystery series. It's fine to have a mystery in there give them something to do, but this isn't really where my heart is. And so I, bring in lots of different aspects, as you said, the historical fiction piece and the romance piece. And certain books are heavier in, certain genres. But I did worry how would, because I'm in Sisters in Crime and different writing groups. So I thought, am I going to get all this backlash because it's not mystery enough, or backlash because it's not romance enough to be categorized as romance? And so far, I haven't really run into that backlash that I was afraid of. There are a couple people maybe who have written to me and said, book 2 isn't really I wouldn't call this a mystery per se, and that's fine. That's their opinion, and maybe that's all they read. But most readers, I think, aren't that hardcore. I mean, they don't.
Yeah.
They read many different things.
Oh, absolutely. And when I look for a book, I start in categories that I like, but I like a lot of different categories. And I'm not one of those guys that sits there and checks off the tropes. If this is a mystery, was there a hidden weapon? Check. And, I don't. I think there are some of those hardcore readers out there, but I think the vast majority just don't read like that.
No, and you brought up the whole marketing piece, and that's I think the hardest thing is when you're marketing and you're trying to hit those audiences that might be interested in your book, and then that gets tied into, of course, your Amazon categories, or your the categories, more importantly, that Ingram puts you in, the distributor. That's who you really have to, please, because they're telling the bookstores literally what shelf to put you on. So you kind of have to have that right.
Right. It's when you're talking about the marketing piece, whether you are a hybrid author or a self-published author or a traditionally published author, you better be in tune with marketing now, because it doesn't matter if you have a giant publishing house behind you. You have to get out there and sell the book. Today, when we're recording this, I released a show with Brad Meltzer, and his new book just came out yesterday, and he sold 12 million books, and he's working Twitter today like a madman, trying to get the word out about the book. It doesn't matter. You've got to be, if you don't tell people about your book, unless you're just one of the lucky few, people aren't going to find it. You've got to be in tune with the business of writing. As sad as that is, it's just the truth. It's the truth of it.
Yeah, exactly. You had said before that it's a great time for authors to be in publishing, and that's for sure. But the downside is that you also have to be a marketer. You have
That's
to
exactly
be
right.
Wearing that hat, and that's something that she writes really pushes, is for you to have some sort of PR company that you've hired, because you're going nowhere otherwise. I think there's like 1 million books a year published between traditionally and self-pub. I mean, you need something to stand out in that crowd.
Right. Well, the great news is you are in charge of your book, and the bad news is you are in charge of your book.
Exactly. That's perfect. Love it.
So, what do you have a daily writing habit, Michelle? Do you've got 3 books out, you've got a 4th finished, you're working on a 5th. That's pretty proficient. How do you keep the machine running, and how do you keep the ideas flowing and show up to work on the book every day?
Well, as soon as my kids get on the bus in the morning, so they get on the bus at 6:50. So I grab some coffee and I go upstairs, and I might allow myself to just 5 minutes to quickly look through social media if there's any huge thing, and I won the Pulitzer or something. And then I turn that off and I start writing. So I have to just write in the very early morning when my brain is very, very fresh. And I was trying to write on a timing system, an hour or an hour and a half, but this year I'm actually, my secret goal is to write 2 books in 2018. And in order to do that, I've calculated I need to write 1,000 words a day. So I switched to that. I write 1,000 words a day, and then I stop doing that, and I start the rest of the day until they come home is just spent on marketing and PR, social media, writing my blog, writing my newsletter, writing articles to get published, contests, all of that kind of stuff.
Do you plot ahead of time? Are you a plotter or pantser? Kind of what's the planning stage of your book like?
Well, I would call myself more a plotter. So I sit down with before I start the book and come up with the basic outline. And now that I'm on book 5, I mean, there's a lot of characters and there's a lot of plot lines running. So, I have to sort of sketch out the plot lines that are going to surface in that particular book, and then maybe do like a chapter thing, like chapter 1 is going to be this, and then I'll start writing, and then maybe after like the chapter 5 point, I need to reassess the outline, and it usually changes from what I originally wanted it to be. So it's kind of that whole process all the way through the first draft. Write maybe 5 chapters and then reassess. And I like to take a walk at night, and that's a great time to get the ideas flowing, because I kind of know what chapter I want to write the next day, but walking the night before helps me solidify exactly what I want to do. It's great for ideas.
It really is. A lot of people say they get ideas in the shower. I like you. I like to go for a walk and just completely change the scenery. And there's something about getting your body to do something else and mundane and keeping it engaged that just lets your mind kind of get in touch with what you're really thinking about.
Yeah, it's weird. It's strange. I mean, they say that Dickens used to walk for hours through the streets of London, and I used to think it was because he was getting, ideas like from the seedy side of London. But I now think he was trying to come up with ideas, just walking.
Yeah, I think that Stephen King, I think, does the same thing, or at least he used to before getting hit by a car. So be careful when you're walking.
Good point.
But yeah, that's great. Michelle, I love what you're doing. The Henrietta and Inspector Howard series is amazing. It's such a great combination of things that I love, and I love that you're doing it. Where can people find you online if they're not familiar with you and with your series, and how can they get plugged in to follow along and get to know you?
Well, that's great. MichelleCoxWrites.com is my website, and I have all my links right there, all the icons. So I'm on Twitter, Instagram, of course, Facebook. Of course, books are on Amazon, Nook, Google Play, Kobo, all of the big platforms, and in lots of bookstores.
Excellent. Dear listeners, go out and buy A Promise Given. It's a new book in the series, but there's 2 others, A Girl Like You and A Ring of Truth, that are available also. Go pick those up. Get into the series. You're going to love it. Michelle, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
On the Wednesday night before Thanksgiving, Joey locked the doors of the Washington Irving Chapel and checked the windows from the outside, making sure that the cemetery offices were dark. Satisfied, he donned a knit cap and trudged uphill to the employee parking lot. He'd forgotten how desolate the grounds became at night. A fog had gathered, blurring the moon and stars. His rusty Volkswagen Beetle, christened Ladybug by Jason, sat in shadow alongside his dad's white van, which bore an image of the horseman and the cemetery's web address. Joey swept a palmful of condensation from Ladybug's windshield and fumbled for his keys. He heard a laugh, high and young. He froze. "Hello?" He shook off gooseflesh and found his key. He started the engine and backed out, headlights off, praying not to knock over a headstone, again. A child stood on the hillside amongst the graves. "You okay, kid? Cemetery's closed." He turned on his headlights. The child vanished. Joey idled in the drive, frowning. What had just happened? He turned off the headlights and waited for his eyes to adjust. The silhouette reappeared. The child stood in the road now, blocking his way. He and the ghost stared at each other. He bit his tongue and squinted over the steering wheel. He couldn't resolve the ghost's features, only a tiny body in ruffles? Yes, a dress. A little girl with shoulder-length hair. The figure crouched, threw its arms over its head and skipped away. A giggle followed after. The ghost skipped up the hill, turned around, and beckoned through the fog. "Please come." Joey shook his head. "No way. Ain't gonna happen." But he felt compelled to follow. What could a little girl do to him after all? He would keep a safe distance. The gravel sounded like soft rain beneath his tires. It drew him helplessly, past weeping cypresses and mausoleums blue with moonlight. He followed the giggle, the skipping ribbons, the little body made of shadow and quicksilver. The north end of the cemetery grounds rose to a steep wooded slope. The ghost had led him to Section 77, the northernmost boundary of the cemetery, but he'd lost her. He killed the engine, summoned his courage, and climbed out. The night air brought him fully awake. "Where are you?" he whispered, scanning the graves. A row of diseased hemlock trees stood at the fence line. Joey knew them well. They were dying, infested by some parasite called, he fished for the name, woolly adelgig. His crew had cut them back many times, lopping off limbs and heads, trying to save them. The hemlocks had grown back twisted and tormented. They stood as a row of grotesque sentinels guarding the threshold of the forest. The ghost climbed the slope, spun at the fence, and sat hugging her knees. The black mass of the Rockefeller State Park Preserve loomed behind her. "What do you want?" Joey whispered. "Play." He stepped forward, hands shaking. He just wanted to see her face, the face of a real ghost. To see the curve of her cheek, the sparkle that might have been her left eye. "Come and play, Joey." He froze. The sound of his name terrified him. She pointed over his shoulder. "Play with us." He turned and realized his mistake. He'd driven with his eyes on the girl, trying not to lose her, never looking behind. They had been followed.